Hello, and on today's Study History with Mr. P video, I'm going to look at poverty and the problem of the poor in Elizabethan England. So poverty increased in Elizabethan England for a number of reasons, due to population growth, rising prices, changes in the countryside, and the increase in vagabondage. So population growth, first of all. England's population grew by 35% during Elizabeth's reign. Towns and cities grew fast and people needed feeding. Food was grown in the countryside and brought into urban areas for sale. Because there was more people to feed, the price of food in towns rose. So rising prices. The price of food went up even more when harvests were bad. Bread was the basis of most people's diets and grain prices rose fastest of all. Wages rose more slowly than prices, and with more people wanting work, labour became cheaper, which meant that employers could pay lower wages. There were then a few different changes in the countryside, so sheep farming. English wool was in high demand around the world at the time. It was so profitable that more land was used for sheep farming. This did not require much labour, and so people became unemployed. It also meant more land was not used for grain crops. There was also an increase in enclosure. So advances in farming techniques made it more profitable to enclose land into smaller fields which needed fewer workers. It was also done to stop livestock that was being bred from wandering off. Common land, where people had been free to grow food for themselves, was also enclosed by landowners. As the money to be made from farming increased, landowners put up the rent of tenant farmers. Those who couldn't pay were forced off of their land, and they were replaced by wealthier farmers, or so that the land could be enclosed. There was then also an increase in vagabondage. So vagabonds were homeless people without jobs who roamed the countryside. Um, and vagabonds lived outside of the Elizabethan social hierarchy and was seen as a threat to both law and order. Rural depopulation made the problem of vagabondage worse because people had left their villages to find work in towns and cities. Then, when they could not do so, they became beggars or turned to crime. And vagabonds were treated very harshly. So, who were the poor in Elizabethan society? Well, not being able to work meant a life of poverty. Unemployment and illness could lead to starvation, and Elizabethan society was concerned with those who were poor enough to need financial help, or poor relief, or charity alms, or who begged or were homeless. There were changes in attitude and policies towards the poor. So poor relief was a local issue, but Elizabeth's government adopted a more national approach. New laws were passed. Some were due to fear of vagrancy and social unrest, but they also showed changes in how the poor were seen. So the impotent and the able-bodied. So poor relief is the name of the financial help that was available for the very poor and was paid for by a local tax called the poor rate. It was organised by justices of the peace, and helping the less fortunate was seen as a Christian duty. The Tudors were sympathetic to the impotent or deserving poor, which is those people who were unable to work due to their age or illness, but treated those who were fit to work but didn't, the able-bodied or idle poor, more harshly. Vagrants who were caught faced punishments such as whipping or imprisonment, and in towns the problem of the able-bodied poor was more noticeable because they were so visible. The cloth trade was especially bad in the years 1563 to 4, 68 to 73, and 1586 to 88. In these times, the numbers of able-bodied poor increased, and unemployment was recognised as both a social and economic problem, which led to new ways to help the poor, and key laws were introduced in 1563, 72, and 76. So what was the action that the government took? Well, in 1563, the Statute of Artificers was introduced. This aimed to ensure that poor relief was collected, and anyone who refused to pay the poor rates could be imprisoned, and officials failing to organise poor relief could be fined up to £20. Then in 1572, a Vagabonds Act was passed, which aimed to deter vagrancy. The Act stated that vagrants were to be whipped and have a hole drilled through each ear. Vagrants were also to be imprisoned if arrested a second time for vagrancy and given the death penalty for a third offence. It also established a national poor rate for the first time. This sheltered the impotent poor, and JPs were required to keep a register of the poor. Unemployment was recognised as a real problem, in this 1572 Act as well. Towns and cities were given the responsibility to find work for able-bodied poor. Poor children were to be taken in by tradesmen who would teach them as an apprentice until they had grown up. Then came the 1576 Poor Relief Act, which distinguished between able-bodied and impotent poor and gave help to and also to help the able-bodied poor to find work. So JPs provided the able-bodied poor with wool and raw materials to enable them to work by making things to sell. Those who refused to work, where they were given help, were to be sent to a special prison funded by a poor rate known as a house of correction. So what was the impact of these poor laws? Well, there was some change for the better, but poverty was still a major issue. Ordinary people were often sympathetic to vagabonds, and in most cases they were given money and sent on their way. Perhaps the most important change was the recognition that unemployment was a genuine problem, and it became the law to provide the poor with a way to make and sell things.